Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Judith Wright, the Assistant Director at the Homewood Public Library. I'm excited to present Carrie LeGarde. I hope I said your name correctly. She is a forensic anthropologist, and she's going to talk to us about her work honoring the lives lost at Pearl Harbor. And this is a partnership through the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. So we're very excited that she's able to zoom in with us, and she's actually in Hawaii. So you see that lovely weather behind her. So Carrie, I am going to turn it over to you. We're very excited to hear about this. This is going to be recorded, and I will send out a recording link later. That way you can rewatch or anything you want to share with your friends. That is also wonderful. Carrie?
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to be here and talk to you about DPAA for short. It's a mouthful when you say the whole thing. And then I'm the project lead for the USS Oklahoma Identification Project. So then I'm going to talk about that project specifically. So that's why I'm here in Hawaii. Is because we will be reinterring the remains that could not be identified on December 7th on the 80th anniversary. So I'm here in Hawaii for that. I can talk for a very long time about both DPAA and the Oklahoma project specifically. So I'm really trying to keep myself on task here. And please do ask questions. I'm happy to answer any of those. So, So DPAA was officially formed in 2015 because we actually were a command previously. And so in 2015, we merged with some other organizations to become an agency. And so we work within the Department of Defense. It's headquartered in DC, but the kind of primary operations exist in Hawaii. So the Hawaii laboratory is on Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam. And this laboratory has been working in some capacity. We've changed names several times, but since the 80s, but really the roots go all the way back to after World War II. So I started working for the agency in Hawaii. At the time, we didn't have a laboratory at Offutt, but now we do. That started in 2015, was really when it started working on casework. And I've been working out of that laboratory since 2016. So, and then we also have a laboratory at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, but that is just for life support evidence and analysis. And we actually have a large library basically for life support material. And so this is anything that would be on the person in an aircraft primarily. So their parachute, their flight suit, anything that is related to some sort of life support capacity. So our mission is to provide the fullest possible accounting of our missing personnel to their families. This is primarily military, but it does include civilians. And we go all over the world to complete this mission. So we do a lot of work in Southeast Asia and Europe, but this does include some losses within the US and other countries as well. And this image just shows the number of missing from these different areas. So it's over 80,000 men are still listed in this missing in action or killed in action capacity that have not been returned. to their families. So the vast majority is World War II. So as part of this process to try to identify, so we're trying to find, recover, and identify the remains of these missing service members. And throughout that process, we have to combine several different scientific analyses and components. And so this image kind of shows all the things, sorry, there's that are going to go into this identification process. So I'm going to start with the historical information because that's such a critical piece of this entire work that we're doing. So we need that historical information and historical research to be able to do the tasks that we need to do. And so part of this is in the form of historians that work in the agency and go through the records having to do with our missing service members. And then we also have investigative teams that actually go out into the field to talk to witnesses, so locals that either witnessed something, a plane crashing or individual being buried, or they've heard this story be kind of passed down through their family. And so these investigative teams will go out and try to determine if a plane really did crash in this spot and that we should then send a large recovery team out to actually excavate and try to find remains. Because these investigative missions are a way to make sure that we're not going on kind of a wild goose chase with a large recovery team, because those teams are large and it takes a lot of communication with the other governments to do that type of work. So we are getting remains into the laboratory from two different routes. One of those are these excavations that I was starting to talk about. And then the other would be disinterments. And the disinterments take place within the US, but also overseas. And these are remains that have been buried as unknowns. But we have discovered through historical research that we think that these remains belong to a particular service member. And so then we can disinter or exhume those remains to try to identify them. So remains disinterred from Europe are analyzed at the Offutt laboratory, and then remains that are disinterred from the Punch Bowl Cemetery in Hawaii or the Philippines or other places in the Pacific Theater would go to the Hawaii laboratory for analysis. So I got a little bit ahead of myself. I talked through these components already. And so an important part of the recovery teams, the archaeological recoveries that are going on, that some of those are actually conducted by external partners. So we do partner with organizations that actually do the excavations. And then if they find any remains or life support material, then that is sent to our laboratories for analysis. So this just shows a few images of what archaeology at DPAA might look like. So actually the work being done in the field. So we do terrestrial excavations, but then also underwater excavations. So this image on the right is showing a diver that we would be using for an underwater excavation. So these are military divers that do that, but it's led by an underwater archaeologist. And then on the left, you can see an image of an excavator that we do use in some cases. And the middle image is one of our archaeologists with a total station doing a little bit of work there. So this just shows the different types of areas that we might get into. So sometimes we're working on really steep slopes. So if a plane crashed into a mountainside, then we're going to try to go there, and we have to have people that are certified for mountaineering. And so they have to go through training to be able to do that type of work. And then it might be a rice paddy field. But oftentimes it's in the jungle in Southeast Asia and more difficult to get into. Sometimes we have to be helicoptered into our sites. And then sometimes it might be right in a village or next to someone's home that they maybe found remains. So someone had been buried next to their home or under their home even. And so the work can take place in a lot of different areas. And then the image in the lower right is showing one of those underwater recoveries. And then here's just another image of excavating in the field. You can see on the left that there are a lot of local workers. So part of when we go into the field, these teams that we take are composed primarily of military personnel that will serve kind of in different capacities for the team. But to really be able to get all the work done, we need more support. And so part of with working with these foreign governments is that we're trying to provide some work for locals. And so we employ local workers to help us on site for being able to complete this mission. So an example I did one recovery mission in Laos, and we had 100 local workers helping us on our site because it was so big. And we set up these bucket lines. That's what's kind of shown here. And so that then they can stand in a line and not have to walk the dirt that's being removed from the site, and they can just hand it on to the next. And then they go to these screening stations. So all of the soil has to pass through these screening stations. And in some cases, the soil is of a type that we need to use water. And so these teams have come up with a pretty elaborate system to be able to set up these water screening stations so that then you can have a lineup of these, it's wire mesh that are typically a 1/4 inch, the mesh, and just one next to another, working the dirt through. And for the water systems, they can set them up where there are all these drops of water coming down that then works through down into a pond or something that's out of the way. But all of this work is done by the local workers that are helping us, and then it's overseen by team members and ultimately overseen by an anthropologist or archaeologist, because they are the expert on site. And so that's part of my job, is to also serve as one of those anthropologists in the field. So anything that's found in these screens, so the purpose is to get the dirt to go through, but then leave behind any type of material evidence. So parts of their G-suit or their helmet or a ring or anything like that that could have been on the person or persons that we're looking for. And then any bone or teeth that we can find. And a lot of these environments, especially if it is a plane crash, the bones don't survive real well. And so we're looking for small bone fragments or teeth. And that's why everything goes through these mesh screens, because we're just looking for that little fragment, and that might be all that we're going to find. So this is showing some examples of the material evidence that might be found, and some ID or coins. And sometimes this is just used to show us that, yes, this is a U.S. Military personnel's material that just lets us know that we're in the right place. So once we get back, if we find anything, or for disinterments, when we're back in the laboratory, then we're going to be analyzing any remains in the same manner, whether it's found in the field or from a disinterment. And so part of that was first the, any material evidence. And then we have dentists that work with the laboratory. And so they'll do analysis of the teeth. And compare to any antemortem records. So any records in the service member's military file. For a lot of these, especially World War II, there aren't x-rays that we can compare to. So it's just written dental charts that we're comparing. So then another big component would be the anthropology. Which is what I would be contributing then on the laboratory side. And in this upper left photo, that's a picture from the Offutt Laboratory, Dr. Carrie Brown. She was the first anthropologist to work at the Offutt Laboratory. And then a historical photo down here on the right. But what the anthropologists are trying to do are determine a biological profile, which includes determining sex, age, ancestry, stature, and we're looking for any trauma, because this could help us relate to what happened when they died, and then any individualizing traits. And so these might be looking for a fracture that occurred during life. So maybe a collarbone fracture, or if there was a broken leg, because these things might be in their military file, and we can use that as extra support for determining who these remains belong to. Something else that we can do, and this is something that's actually been developed by people at DPAA, is chest radiograph comparison. So on the right is an x-ray, a chest x-ray that was taken of a service member. And on the left are the remains that have been recovered. So the clavicles, so the collarbones, and then some of the vertebrae can be compared to this chest x-ray and look for concordances. So that's what these little arrows are pointing to. They'll actually superimpose the x-ray of the remains over the image and look for all of these points, and then they'll mark them. And the more concordances, the better. And so these, for the Korean War, we have a lot of these x-rays. For World War II, we do, but we aren't able to use them as much at this time. But these x-rays were taken to check for tuberculosis when they entered the military. And so that's why for the Korean War, we have very good coverage for these in their files because they were retained and not destroyed, luckily. And then, of course, DNA serves a very important part of this entire work. And this is something that for the Oklahoma is a very large component of what we're doing now and why we're able to make the identifications that we can versus the work that they were doing back in the 1940s. So we cut the bones, we cut the sample and send it to the Armed Forces Medical Examiner System, to their DNA identification laboratory, and then they provide us the results that we can use, and they compare the DNA from the bone to DNA from living family members. And we generally use with bone mitochondrial DNA, which is passed through the maternal line. So this DNA isn't specific to a person, but it's something that we can use to help narrow down our pool of possible individuals. And then there are also statistics related to it that can tell us how likely it is to be this person versus someone out of the entire population. So all of these that we talked about, the historical research, the odontology, the anthropology, material evidence, DNA, all of this then is going to be used to identify a service member. And many of these components aren't positive forms of identification. Sometimes dental comparison can be a positive form of ID, but oftentimes it's not a positive ID, but by putting all of these pieces together, it can give us enough evidence to say that it is this service member. And then our identifications are made by a medical examiner. And once an identification is made, the casualty office then notifies the family of that identification. And then they are the ones that are communicating with the families to decide what to do next, where they want to bury their loved one, and all of those decisions. So the laboratory has a lot of different special projects that we're working on. The remains from the Korean War have been one of the longer projects that we have had at the agency, and that's actually when I started working here. I was working on the Korean War identification project, but now we have several other projects, and we call them projects because it's a kind of specific pool of individuals that we're looking to identify, and for many of these projects, the remains are commingled, and so we want to have one person that is managing this project and really keeping an eye on what's going on and making sure that things are progressing and that analyses are being conducted that need to be done. And so these projects are each assigned to an anthropologist to manage. So I have been managing the Oklahoma project. I didn't start out as the project manager, but I took over when Dr. Carrie Brown, she became a manager and then passed the project to me. And if there are questions, I can't actually see the comments right now.
I can monitor the chat and I'll jump in if anyone asks a comment in the chat, so don't worry about that.
Okay. So now I'm going to kind of kick over and talk about the Oklahoma. This image on the left shows where the ships were on December 7th. And so the arrow is pointing to the Oklahoma. So of course this was on December 7th, and the Oklahoma was one of the ships that was hit very early on and capsized quickly. And I'm not going to go into the incident. I think you all might have more about this later. But the photo on the right is a historical photo that you can see the water splashing up from torpedo hits. So the Oklahoma specifically, there were 429 service members that died. So the image on the left shows when they were trying to help free men from the ship. And so they were able to rescue several men, but ultimately 429 died, many of which were trapped within the ship. In the days after the incident, any men that were recovered from the water or portions of the ship that they could access, they would have been buried in the cemetery in Hawaii. There were 2 different cemeteries that they were using at the time, and part of it was that they started using one and it filled and they had to start burying in another. And so those took place, and they weren't doing any identifications at the time. So they maybe had a name associated to a body that they were burying, but they just noted that name and notified the family, but buried them for any official identifications to occur later, because of course it was war and they needed to focus their efforts on that. So the images on the right are showing them righting the ship. So the intention was to salvage the Oklahoma and put it back into use. And this process took several years. So they started in 1942, but it took into 1943 and even to 1944 to get the ship completely righted. And ultimately, they weren't able to put it back into service, and they were taking it to California, and it ended up sinking, and that's where she stays. But during this time, they tried to recover all the remains from the ship that they could. So this is an image showing salvage and recovery efforts. So they pumped water out of the ship and tried to recover remains. And they tried to, because at this point, because it was a year or more past the incident, these were mostly skeletal remains. And so they tried to keep bones together that looked like they were an individual, and then those were given a number and buried. And so they did the best that they could, but at this time already, a lot of these bones were mixed up. And they did try to recover as much as they could, but there are hands and feet and smaller bones like that just weren't recovered. We do have some, but not a lot. So, so those remains were buried. And then it wasn't until after the war, in 1947, that then there were efforts to try to identify men that died during the war. So this image shows in Hawaii at Schofield Barracks was where they were trying to analyze these remains. And it's a little bit hard to see, but these tables are just full of skeletal remains. And they're a little bit on a portion of the table, you might be able to see a skull and some long bones, so bones of the arms and legs, and smaller bones. But there are several people working on these remains trying to determine who they are. A big part of the Oklahoma was that those remains were mixed up, from the way that they were recovered from the ship. They had a very difficult task from the beginning. So they tried to make as many identifications as they could. And so they did identify 35 ultimately. Many of these would be some of those that had been buried in the days following the incident that had a name associated with them. And then there were some others that were made that would have been remains from the ship. And these would have primarily been based on dental. So if there was someone with a really unique dental record, then that may be a way that they could make those identifications. But of course, DNA wasn't something that was available at the time, DNA analysis. And so that's why that dental was the main component used for identifications. So of the 429, they were only able to identify 35. And so these remains were then ultimately reburied in the punch bowl. And they were buried as an individual that as best they could. So they tried to put remains together that they thought went together, but they couldn't determine who they were. And so these were, we give them an X number, and they're wrapped in a blanket and placed in these caskets. So several of these would be in one casket together, but separated and with a number tied to them. So then we fast forward to 2003, and this is when the first modern day work related to the Oklahoma started. And this is primarily because of a Pearl Harbor survivor, Mr. Ray Emery, who did a lot of research, and there were a lot of documents available related to the work that was done in the 1950s. And there were tentative names listed for some remains. And so he did a lot of research, and he believed that in this one casket, there were these particular service members' remains based on that historical documentation. And so through his efforts, ultimately, we did disinter one casket that had 5 unknowns. And at this time, there were 394 service members unaccounted for. So from this one casket, we did almost 200 DNA samples. So trying to really determine how commingled, how mixed up these remains were. And we discovered that they were very mixed up. So supposed to be 5 individuals, but we realized that we had almost 100 different people represented by these remains. And so this just shows an example of in one X number, so one kind of bundle, all of the different sequences that we discovered. So on the left, it's showing the bones that were tested for DNA out of this one bundle. And then on the right, it's showing all the different DNA sequences. So each color represents a different sequence. So it just showed how mixed up these remains were and what a big undertaking this would be if we wanted to identify everybody. And that if we did, then we needed all of the remains to be able to look at together. Because if a quarter of the men that we're trying to identify are in one casket and there are 60 other caskets, then we know their remains are going to be all across those, and we need them all at one time. So this was kind of the beginning of trying to get that approval to go ahead and try to identify everybody. And we were able to, from this casket, we did identify 5 individuals, but these were partial remains. So we knew that there would probably be more bones for these individuals in other caskets. But this began a long process to try to get this approval to do this work. And part of this had to come from input from the families, and the families wanting to do this, because this is disturbing the remains of these men, and is that the best thing to do? And so ultimately we did get approval, and in 2015 we disinterred all of the remains associated with Oklahoma. So this just shows kind of what a casket looks like when it comes out of the Punch Bowl Cemetery. So they're metal caskets that are actually in fairly good shape, I guess. So, and then this is an example of what it looks like inside that casket. And so there are 5 different bundles there wrapped up. And this is a good example. They don't always survive this well, but this is what we hope to find. So all of these remains were ultimately sent to the Offutt laboratory because we needed a large amount of space to look at these remains. And the Offutt laboratory was new at the time, and we had the space to be able to analyze these remains. So this process was to inventory every X number. And so every bone would get a number and put into the system with any information that we could get from it. So measurements, if we thought bones went together, so a left and a right arm bone matched, we say a pair match, then we would note that information. Or if we could articulate at a joint, so like the elbow, and say that all the bones of the arm go together, that type of information would be documented, because we wanted to use that to have an informed DNA sampling strategy, because we inventoried 13,000 bones and we can't DNA sample all of those. And so we want to be strategic about the way that we do this and which bones are going to give us the most information. And then, so we did sample almost 5,000 bones. And then those were sent to AFMEs, so the Armed Forces DNA Laboratory. And that's where then they would do the testing and compare the DNA from the bones to the family reference samples that have been obtained from the Oklahoma service members' families. So then once we get the DNA back, part of my job as the project lead is to determine which cases to work first. And that's primarily based on the DNA sequence that we're getting. And so that's one DNA sequence will be assigned to an anthropologist, and then they will get all of the bones and any other bones that they can tie in through that pair matching or articulation, and look at them and determine, do we have one individual? Do we have 2? Do we have 10? Because the mitochondrial DNA isn't specific to a person. So several people can have the same. And you can kind of think of it like a last name where there are lots of Smiths, but they might not really be related. And that's what can happen with DNA. And so then we need to determine, well, in this DNA sequence, then which bones go together. And sometimes we can do that based on anthropology and the size of the remains. But sometimes we need additional types of DNA to help us do that, because we're looking at this pool of individuals that were all very similar in age, similar in height. Of course, we have some of those that are really tall or short. And there were some individuals that were around 40 So they stood out from the 20-year-olds. But a vast majority of them were between 18 and 25 and 5'7" to 5'9". And so that makes our job a little more complicated and why we need a lot of DNA testing. And so then we'll use that information that we've obtained through the anthropology, dental comparisons, and we'll put all those pieces together to then tie a name to a set of remains. And then we present for identification to the medical examiner. If he agrees that we have enough information to identify that service member, then we can proceed. So for the Oklahoma, we have finished that process. We've done everything we can at this point to identify the remains. We've done all of the DNA testing that we feel we can do, and we have identified 361 of the 394. So this is 92%, which is really exciting because at the beginning, the goal was 80%, and we surpassed that and really identified a huge number. So it does leave 33 that we could not individually identify, but we did identify all of the Marines. We also identified all of the sets of brothers that died on the Oklahoma. There were 6 sets of brothers where both brothers died, or in one case, there were 3 brothers, the Barber brothers, the top left, and all 3 of them died. But we have been able to identify all of them, so that's very exciting. And then, so now the remains that we cannot identify will be reinterred on December 7th next week, which will commemorate all 429, but then also specifically those 33 that we weren't able to individually identify. And that is the quick rundown of the Oklahoma project and the DPAA. So now I'm open for questions.
Could you tell us a little bit about next week's plans and what y'all are working towards, and just the general, as we can hear by the birds, you're in Hawaii. So.
Yes, so there will be a ceremony at the Punch Bowl, and this will be live streamed. So I can send the link to that to you so that you could post that or something for people to be able to watch. So it's at 11:30 Hawaii time on Tuesday, and it will ultimately, there are 4 caskets that are being buried in 2 of the original graves. So the graves that these remains were buried in for so long, they will be going back into 2 of those. And so this ceremony will commemorate that, and those remains will be buried.
We would love the link. I can include it when I send the recording. Does anyone else have any questions? You're welcome to unmute yourself or type them in the chat.
And I did put, so on this slide, there's a few different places where you can find information about DPAA, the main website, and then there is a Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, and they do post a lot of photos. And then at the bottom, I put the DVids that photos are posted on that site, and that's the site that live streams take place on too. So just different resources for information about us.
Heidi has a question. She wants to know what project is next for you.
Well, that's a good question. I don't know for sure yet because it's still being approved. So I'm going to have a little bit of time where I'm not managing a project, which will be pretty different since the Oklahoma has been 100% of my work life. And so I'll have a bit of time that I'm doing other anthropology work. And actually, I will be going on a field recovery in January until March. So that will be keeping me busy.
Very nice. Does anyone else have any questions? Oh, she wants to, Ben and George. Hey, Ben and George, they want to know where the next field project is.
I will be going to Laos.
Laos. Very nice.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, if no one has any questions, I want to take this time to thank Carrie because you are in Hawaii, you are getting ready, and I really appreciate you zooming in with us. I also want to thank the DPAA, including my sister Ashley, who suggested this. She works for them, and she was so excited because she sees what we do at Homewood Library, and she's like, let's partner up. So this was great. And Carrie, I've really enjoyed that. We are recording. You'll receive an email from me maybe in a couple of days with the link so you can rewatch it and share. And I'll also include the live stream link that Carrie's going to send so you can see what they are doing. On December 7th, Nikki Sepsis, who is a kind of a local speaker who does events, historic events for the Homewood Library, will join us in person. So we've been doing a Zoom, and now we're going to do an in-person. So he is 1 o'clock, and he is going to present more on the actual timeline of Pearl Harbor, the air raid, and everything like that. And that'll be at 1 o'clock, and I believe it's in our large auditorium. So we're looking forward to that. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and thank you, Carrie, for zooming in with us. Yeah. What time is it there?
It's 10.
10,
so
okay.
It's not too early at all.
We had a little bit because there's so many time zone differences, but also, if I'm not mistaken, Hawaii doesn't celebrate or observe daylight savings time, so that kind of threw us for a loop when we were actually scheduling it.
Yes.
And Heidi commented, she said she wanted to thank you for everything y'all are doing and to honor these fallen service members and their families, and we also appreciate your work with them.
Thank you. I really love this work, and it's very rewarding. So, all right. Thank you.
Everyone have a great day. Thank you so much. Take care.